Russia's invasion into Ukraine has divided the world. The United States and its allies in the West have tried to project a united front against Russian aggression. But Russia too has mustered its allies. So let's now take a look at who has backed the war and who has condemned it in the slightest terms, and who has remained neutral during what is now becoming Europe's worst crisis since World War II. Let's start with the US-sponsored draft resolution at the UNSC. The draft sought to deplore in the strongest terms Russia's aggression against Ukraine. The draft resolution was bound to fail. Russia, as a permanent member, vetoed the draft, while China, India and the United Arab Emirates, or UAE, abstained from voting. While 11 nations, including the 3 permanent members like the US, the UK and France, and 8 non-permanent members, Albania, Brazil, Gabon, Ghana, Ireland, Kenya, Mexico and Norway, vetoed in its favour. Far from being isolated from the international community, despite the sweeping sanctions, Putin has managed to cement his ties with China. In his visit to Beijing in the first week of February, Moscow and Beijing entered into a deep strategic partnership with no limits, and where the two allies agreed that there are no forbidden areas of cooperation. Russia, through its strategic intervention in the Syrian civil war, has now earned an ally in Bashar al-Assad. Since 2011, the United States has pursued a policy of regime change in Syria by backing the rebels fighting against government to oust Bashar al-Assad from Damascus. But Putin, through military and from 2011 and direct military involvement as well in Syria from the years 2015, has helped Assad. And this, of course, has turned the tide of the Syrian civil war. Russia has its only Mediterranean port in Syria at Tartus. It also exercises close control over the Syrian port of Latakia that has now turned Syria into a stout Russian ally in the region. Syria is the only other country after Russia to have recognized the controversial regions of Donetsk and Luhansk as independent republics. The Russian Deputy Prime Minister Yuri Bardulov was on a whirlwind tour of the leftist nations in the Western Hemisphere recently. From the 16th of January, he met with leaders of Venezuela, Cuba and Nicaragua and signed a series of cooperation agreements as aspects such as trade, energy and financial cooperation come into spotlight. Russia's decisive intervention into Kazakhstan has reiterated Russia's position of preeminence in Central Asia in the month of January at least. Kazakhstan erupted in a nationwide unrest sparked by a spike in fuel prices, but Russia, leading the NATO troops, leading the CSTO troops that is, in a short and decisive operation, most Central Asian nations have now maintained friendly relations with Moscow and have not condemned Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So, although the United States has been working its diplomatic levers to isolate Russia for invading Ukraine, Vladimir Putin, so far in the conflict, has successfully managed to call the American bluff and has also shored up support for the Russian invasion. For more updates, the editor-in-chief of BNE IntelliNews, Ben Aris, is now joining us live from Berlin. Ben, thanks so much for joining us. My first question to you, what do you make of the recent developments in Ukraine? How is Europe responding to this crisis? And is sanctions all that Europe has in its arsenal at this point?
So I think that if Russia's launched a shock and awe campaign, its military vastly outguns the Ukrainian one. However, it's limited itself so far to rocket attacks on strategic assets, military infrastructure. The power station in Kiev was hit last night, and it's escalated this morning. Residential buildings are being targeted. Happily, they're mostly empty, although the civilian casualty has gone up to just under 200 people. But given the scale of this countrywide invasion, 200 is actually still quite a small number. And Europe has been shocked, absolutely shocked. Nobody was expecting Putin to go all the way and go across the border, but he's done it. And now they're scrambling to catch up. However, they put contingency plans in, sanction plans, the legislation, the coordination between Western partners has been ongoing since this started in October, November. And now those things are being rolled out. The sanctions, significant sanctions, have been rolled out. Specifically, the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline has been suspended, killed, the approval process, which was going to be one of the last sanctions, and it actually has been one of the first. Right. And that's a serious blow. And as for the sanctions' effectiveness, unfortunately, Putin has prepared Russia with huge reserves, with low debts, and they're not going to have much effect. They won't hurt the Russian economy. They won't change Putin's mind, nor make him stop this. So we have little leverage over here.
Right, Ben, let's talk about what other European leaders are saying. The French President Emmanuel Macron says that he's convinced that this war will last and warns of tough consequences at home. What could this entail?
Well, if it drags out, I mean, that issue at the moment today is there's heavy Russian military artillery tanks about 30 kilometers north of Kiev. And we're waiting to see if they're going to attempt to take the capital. If they do, then that's going to be extremely bloody, protracted fight. I'm looking today, this morning, the residents of Kiev have been making Molotov cocktails. Klitschko, the mayor, handed out some 10,000 firearms to locals, and people have been given permission to carry and shoot people. So, street-to-street fighting is the prospect. And then Europe, I think, will progressively cut Russia off. I mean, the sanctions on the table already are going to be close down the Russian access to the international banking sector, which is going to hurt. And the big card, the ultimate card, is to ban Russian imports of oil and gas. But that's going to be extraordinarily difficult to do because Russia's deeply embedded in the European economy. And so, unfortunately, although the diplomatic relationships will be completely busted, the energy relationships will have to continue for the meantime. And it's going to leave everyone in. Effectively, it's going to put us back into the Cold War setup. The Soviets sold gas to the West despite the Cold War, but then they also pointed missiles at each other. And that's where we're headed. We're headed back to that kind of relationship.
Right, absolutely. You know, you're talking about the sanctions and how Europe may eventually cut off Russia entirely. But the big question is, why is Putin seemingly unfazed from this kind of global isolation or condemnation? What's his true goal?
I think it's exactly what it says on the can, that he wants a new security arrangement. The problem with the NATO setup, with the current security in Europe, is that it excludes Russia. And Putin, when he came to office in 2000, asked to join NATO. He asked to join the EU, and he was told no in both cases. And then that puts Russia on the outside. And so by definition, NATO is a military organization that has Russia as its enemy. And that's what he's trying to change. He's saying, look, this is very uncomfortable. If you put your NATO missiles into Ukraine, then because they're on the border, the European part of Russia that runs along the other side of that border is home to 80% of the Russian population, who are so close, missile flight times are under 5 minutes, so it's impossible to defend against it. And that's what he's complaining about. But nobody's intending to let Ukraine join NATO. I don't think the West wants to be responsible for NATO because it remains unstable and unpredictable. But Putin has this bee in his bonnet, and he wants to put this issue to rest. So he's doing all of this to try and force the West, Ukraine in particular, into doing some sort of guarantee to put this issue to bed. And he's not going to stop. This is why the invasions happened, why he's gone so far, that he sees it as an existential issue for Russia. And it's his legacy issue as well. He's not going to leave office until he's settled this one way or the other. So we're in the middle of the crisis and remain to see if, like, now there's going to be a new deal, except this deal is going to be a peace deal. But that deal will have to include some sort of security guarantees or Ukrainian neutrality by changing the constitution. That's the least he's going to accept.
Absolutely. Ben Aris, thank you so much for all those insights, and thanks for joining us on WION World is One at this hour. WION World is One is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news updates on the move.